So thank you all for joining us. Thank you everyone who signed up on the back of the conference, and thank you all those who didn't, who just checked out what we had going on. I'll give you a brief intro to Charity Fraud Awareness Week. So although we are outside of Charity Fraud Awareness Week, this webinar comes as part of the week. Charity Fraud Awareness Week is a 9-year-long campaign aimed at giving charities the tools to fight fraud that's being committed against them. And we do that by collaborating with those both in the charity space, but also outside in the counter-fraud space, working with the public, private and third sector. This morning, we're going to be talking about the survey and report done in partnership between BDO and Fraud Advisory Panel. And we'll be looking at some of the results of that, and I will leave the BDO team to discuss that in a minute. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Firstly, you'll notice that your cameras and mics have been turned off. That is just so that we can get through the material. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, because we'll either try and get to them at the end, or if we can't, we might be able to answer them throughout the session, particularly if it's about material that we might be able to provide. This is going out as a recording slightly after today. I won't give you an exact date, but hopefully by the end of the week. And it will all be on the Preventing Charity Fraud website for you to use. So please feel free to use it as you need. With that, I might pass over to Tracy if you are there.
I am indeed.
Perfect. Tracy, over to you.
Thanks, Hope. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, which is going to talk about the charity fraud survey results. For some of you in attendance at the conference, we skipped this portion of the conference, so if you were unable to attend, you didn't miss it, and this isn't a repeat. So I'm going to start off just let you know what we're going to run through. I am going to go through initially the respondents to the survey, the general findings, and I'm going to talk about incidents of reported fraud across charities. I'm going to then pass over to my colleague Holly, who's going to talk about the fraud prevention aspects of the survey. My colleague Sophie will then talk about the Economic and Corporate Crime Act results, which was a new theme for this year. Some questions we ran at the end. So that's going to be the general running order for today, but a little bit about the survey. So Hope's already mentioned that this is the 4th year that we have done this survey in collaboration with Fraud Advisory Panel. And for the last 2 years, it's marked the start of Charity Fraud Awareness Week, when we have launched the results at a full-day conference on the first day of Charity Fraud Awareness Week. So we've been going since 2021, and I think it's fair to say that it has built some momentum. We started off with about 70 respondents in 2021, and this year we got up to 139 respondents, which is the biggest response that we've had so far, which is brilliant. And I think it's a really positive message, as it shows that charities are really willing to share their experiences of fraud with the sector and with their counterparts, and in the private sector and in the charity sector, everyone will learn from those experiences. So I think it's a really tremendous effort that we've had this year. So in terms of the respondents to the survey this year, I mean, broadly, the profile of the respondees is similar to last year. We have 68% are charitable companies, compared to 63% last year, 9% charitable incorporated organisations, 12% Royal Charter, 6% trusts, and 5% unincorporated associations. The role of the people that are actually completing this survey is quite finance-based, with about 54%, 37% of those being finance directed, the rest across treasury and other finance roles. About 17% across internal audit, risk, compliance and legal, and the remainder fall to be trustees and people in fraud roles or operational roles. In terms of the size of the charities, 83% had income over $1 million. That's broadly the same as last year, which was 82%. But there were less charities with income over 10 million this year, dropping to 55%. And we had more charities with income between 5 and 10 million. So slightly smaller, but still all above that million range. Almost half of our charities have a national remit, 24% are international, 15% regional, and 16% are local. This year, for the first time, we asked charities how many trustees they had. We'll all be pleased to hear that 94% had more than 5 trustees, which is considered good practice under the governance code. And there was only one charity that had less than 3 trustees, which really should be the minimum. And I'm sure there might be very good reasons for that at the time of responding to this survey. So in terms of the reports that we have produced in response to this survey, I'll just cover that off briefly and I'll come back to this at the end. But we produced 2 reports this year. Some of you in attendance at the conference will have seen the 2-page flyer, which really is the highlights of this report in a very compact form. And we've also today launched the full report. So those of you attending this conference, this webinar, will be sent that report if you haven't been sent it already, and it is available to download from our website. I have popped the links into this webinar, but you don't need to do anything. You will receive a copy of it, and you can direct colleagues to the report if they also want to download it. So moving on to the next slide, please, Holly. Thank you. So I just wanted to very quickly put the Charity Fraud Survey into some sort of context, and it's quite difficult to find any accurate reporting tools on any sort of fraud, let alone fraud affecting the charity sector. But for some context, we had a look at the most recent British crime survey, and we can see that there were 3.6 million recorded incidents of fraud, which is up slightly from last year at 3.3 million. Fraud is 39% of all incidents, and that increases to 69% if we include theft. Of the 3.6 million, 2.7 million incidents involved a loss of money or property, and 1.9 million or 70%, which I have to say I was quite surprised about, were fully recovered or reimbursed as incidents of fraud. However, the caveat to this is that only 1 in 7 fraud incidents reported to Action Fraud are included only 1 in 7 incident reported to Action Fraud were included in the fraud offences. So in terms of actual recorded fraud offences, which is different to the crime survey in that this is fraud offences that were recorded with the police or another bureau, that was 1.3 million. Those fraud statistics are collected from the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, which comes from Action Fraud, and 2 industry bodies, which is Sidebass and UK Finance. So again, this is slightly up from last year, or they do say that this is attributed to the rise in reporting of fraud via UK Finance. We ourselves run something called Fraud Track, which some of you may be familiar with. This is where we trawl press and public sources for records of reported fraud, and the charity portion of that this year was 2.38 million. There were some stats from Action Fraud and the Charity Commission research last year, which put fraud about 2.7, so broadly similar. And the Charity Commission reported case of fraud this year is 603 cases and 99 cases of cybercrime. So I just wanted to place the survey from our 139 respondents into some sort of context with what's been reported nationally. Next slide, please, Holly. Thank you. So we asked charities various questions about their fraud risk and whether they thought it had increased and what the factors might be that increased fraud. The first stat I'm going to talk about is whether charities thought they'd experienced more or less fraud in the last 12 months. So this is slightly different to the actual experiences of fraud. And this year, 35% thought they experienced more instances of fraud or attempted fraud compared to the previous 12 months. Now, last year it was 36%, so we're falling about the same there. We also asked charities about their actual experiences of fraud. So this is fraud that they've had to deal with, report to the police, etc. So their actual experience. And again, this is broadly the same as last year, so we're at 42% this year, slightly down as it was 43% last year, but pretty much the same. Now we see this as a positive because there was a very big jump in the prior year to 43%. So the fact that this has leveled off, where we're taking that as a positive overall, and what we're really hoping to see next year is that there's a further drop from 42%. The majority of charities that experienced fraud recorded that they experienced between 1 and 5. And that was 26% of charities. However, 10% did experience 10 or more frauds, but this is down from 17% last year. So obviously the higher numbers of fraud, the more challenging that's going to be for a charity to deal with. So we're really pleased that that number has come down. The average number of frauds decreased as well. So the average number of frauds experienced by charities fell to between 4 and 7 per respondent. And that's down from between 5 and 8 in 2023. So again, another positive. If we extrapolate just our respondents' experiences of fraud, however, that does mean that this year there's been somewhere between 260 and 400 frauds experienced by just our respondents alone, which is quite a large number considering that just one incident of fraud can be potentially very devastating for a charity in terms of draining resources, management time, distracting from charitable work, etc. So that is a fairly hefty number. We did this last year, so we thought we'd do it again in terms of trying to extrapolate these numbers to the wider sector, focusing on charities with revenues over £1 million. So they're broadly in line with our respondents' profile. And if we extrapolate that to the wider sector with the equivalent revenues, that could mean roughly between 10 and 20,000 frauds across the sector. And we know from the Police and British Crime Survey stats that not all of these frauds are reported. So again, I think there's a caveat there to this being potentially just the tip of the iceberg. In terms of the cost of living crisis, we asked this for the first time last year, and this year 60% agreed that the cost of living crisis had increased fraud risk over the last 12 months, which has come down slightly from last year. It was 67% last year, so that tells us that charities are feeling a little bit more positive. Obviously, the cost of living crisis has subsided a little bit, but not really. I think everyone is still feeling the strain. And so that will increase risk across charities from various aspects, whether it's staff and volunteers feeling very desperate for funds and committing internal fraud, or an increase in risk from beneficiaries making false applications for grants, etc., or an increase in risk from fundraisers not passing funds on to the charity. Or it could be a decrease in the likelihood of staff and volunteers blowing the whistle when they do see fraud for fear that they don't want to jeopardise their job or their role and they want to maintain the status quo. And also it could lead to a decrease in donations. In terms of expectations next year, we will come on to this a little bit later in more detail. But this year, only 50% of our respondents expected fraud to increase in the next year, compared to 64% last year. And I think this follows the theme of what we've seen overall in the survey this year, which is a slightly more positive approach to fraud and a slightly more positive outlook. So that's great news. Next slide, please, Holly. So we asked respondents about their incidents of fraud, and we asked them who was committing the fraud, what types of fraud they were having, and how the fraud was detected. So in terms of who, it's probably no surprise, but I think the internal threat is still prevalent, and we see that at 50% this year of fraud committed by someone internal to the organisation, whether that's a staff member or a volunteer or a trustee. 29% were committed by someone with no relationship to the charity, which is a slight increase from last year's 23%. If we include those with some sort of link to the charity, i.e. suppliers or beneficiaries, however, that does bump up that internal-external divide a little bit, because those that do have some link are sometimes a little bit of both. There might be an internal link within the charity and there might be some sort of collusion happening with suppliers. But I think what this tells us overall is that if we're 50% internal, 30% external and 20% somewhere in between. It's that really when we're thinking about fraud risk and when we're planning, we really need to make sure that we're covering off all of those risks to ensure maximum protection. In terms of the what, so again, this year, misappropriation of cash and assets remains the highest threat, with 40% experienced this type of fraud across the whole year, and 31% experienced this as their most recent fraud. 33% experienced authorised push payment fraud or APP fraud or payment diversion fraud, as you might be aware of it, when someone convinces you to pay them fraudulently, whether changing supply details on an invoice or by receiving a phishing call. But that is broadly the same as last year, so that we haven't seen a change in that result this year. A further 29% experienced expenses and subsistence fraud over the course of the year, and that dropped to 7% for the most recent fraud, which I don't think I would read anything into that result necessarily. It could just be timing issue, but it is quite a change from the experience over the full 12-month period. As I noted on the prior slide, most charities experience between 4 and 7 frauds. But what we also did was we drilled down and we found that sometimes that wasn't the same type of fraud. So some charities experience 2 different types of fraud. And for example, 58% of those that experienced a payment diversion fraud also experienced some other type of external fraud, such as supplier fraud or cyber fraud. Of those that experienced misappropriation of cash or assets or expenses fraud, 21% experienced both types of these typical internal frauds. And finally, of those that experienced misappropriation of cash or assets or expenses fraud, 29% also experienced an external fraud as well, such as a payment diversion fraud or a cyber fraud. And as I've already said, I think it just really highlights that a charity is not necessarily going to just experience one type of fraud. And so we really can't put all our eggs in one basket when it comes to evaluating our fraud risk. Coming on to how fraud was detected. Probably no surprise to everyone that 62% said it was detected by internal controls. That is a slight decrease from last year, where it was 67%, but I don't think that's a decrease that we should be too worried about. It was still the most common response. 12% said that it was detected by internal whistleblowers, which again is broadly the same as last year. But it does show how important your employees and volunteers are in detecting fraud in your charity. They really are your eyes and ears. And it probably draws to attention 2 important things. One is they really need to have a good understanding of what fraud risk is, of what fraud looks like, what red flags might look like, and also the importance of following key controls and processes, and what their role in identifying weaknesses in those controls and processes is. Because if they're routinely doing a workaround, just because it's always been done that way, you really need your staff to be telling you these sorts of things so that you can put additional controls or testing in place to make sure that those important controls are being followed. The second thing that's really important is that they know how to report concerns if they have them. And that means it needs to be culturally acceptable, and that is, again, kind of all your governance and your anti-fraud culture and your tone from the top, and making that run down through the organisation so anyone internally thinking about blowing the whistle doesn't have that as a concern to think about, as well as the usual, how sure am I that something's happening here and what will happen to me if I do raise a concern. So it's also about making sure that they're aware about the confidentiality provisions in place if they do make a report. So in terms of the next layer, 10% said that fraud was detected by external whistleblowers. And this is an increase from last year. That was only 4% last year. It does show how increasingly important external whistleblowers are. And again, it's important to have a clear pathway that if there's anyone outside of your organisation or someone who works with your organisation, such as a supplier or even a beneficiary, that they also have a clear path to be able to report their concerns if they have any. Next slide, please, Holly. So in terms of total estimated losses due to fraud, this year 84% of our respondees experienced a loss associated with the fraud, which is an improvement from last year when it was 92%. The majority of losses suffered were between 10,000 and 100,000. And that was 40% of our respondees had that loss, and that was 29% last year. So that has increased this year. This year, 10% suffered losses between 100,000 and 1 million, but that is a big reduction from last year of about 56% from 23% last year. And losses over 1 million remained broadly the same. So that's the lower end, 5%. Only 5% of our respondees reported losses over 1 million this year. In terms of losses, extrapolating that to the number of frauds, that leads us to a conclusion that the average loss per fraud was somewhere between 102,000 and 197,000. And that means that in terms of estimated losses, just for our respondees alone, losses were going to be between 5.9 million and 11.4 million. Which is clearly a lot higher than any of the charity-related stats that I've certainly seen in any other research. What we've also done is extrapolated those losses to what that might look like across the sector. And if we do look at the wider sector, and if we apply the rate of fraud to the sector, that could mean losses for the sector of 285 million to 848 million. Which is obviously a very big hit if we're close to estimating anywhere near to the real experience of charity fraud losses. We also asked charities about recoveries after an instance of fraud, and actually it's quite a good result because 40% did recover funds after a fraud. It's a slight decrease from last year's 44%, but again, nothing to worry about. So only a quarter did not recover any losses at all. The good news is that there was some recovery for all frauds over 100,000. So the bigger frauds are possibly getting a bit more attention when it comes to pursuing recoveries, which is great. If we apply these losses, that means that the losses reduce. This is just for our respondents only, and the losses to fraud then reduce somewhere between 3.5 million and 6.8 million, and recoveries will sit somewhere between 2.4 million and 4.6 million. So that's a really, really good stat and a really good outcome for the charities. Again, if we apply those loss and recovery rates to the wider sector, losses will reduce to somewhere between 170 million and 500 million, as recovery sits somewhere between 110 and 300 million. Next slide, please, Holly. So we also ask charities about the non-financial impact of the fraud on charities, because we all know that financial losses are not the only impacts that will be experienced. 78% of charities experience some other impact in addition to financial loss, and that's compared to 56% last year, which looks like a big increase, but we don't see that as a negative increase. I think what we see as is charities recognising the true impact that fraud can have on their organisation, and that means that you can take steps to remedy it if you are aware that it's happening. So charities generally, or 65% of charities, experienced more than one non-financial impact on their organisation. So the main ones to look at here are 21% suffered a loss of morale amongst staff, volunteers or trustees. This is a decrease from last year, so that tells us hopefully that charities are able to manage morale among staff, volunteers or trustees after an experience of fraud. And one of the ways to do that is really to, without breaching any confidentiality over the fraud itself, but perhaps taking away the suspicion and the gossip that people might have about that incident of fraud. And there's nothing wrong with letting people know that your charity's experienced a fraud. It's nothing to be ashamed of. And sometimes going through something together, learning from it, moving on, changing how things are done can actually have a really positive impact on your employees. This year, 21% said that they lost staff and volunteers from the organisation, which is broadly the same as last year. The loss of staff and volunteers might be losing someone on the periphery of the fraud because they didn't like to be in an environment where fraud was happening, or they didn't like how it was managed. But it could also mean that those are losses because of the fraud, because those members were involved in the fraud and there has been action taken after the event of fraud. This year, 12% reported reputational issues, which is down from 24% in 2023. And again, and certainly we've had charities come to our fraud conference this year in November and in the prior year to talk about their experiences of fraud. And surveys such as this talk about fraud openly. And I think hopefully charities will realise that sometimes how you deal with an incident of fraud, how you manage it in the press, how you manage it internally can really have a positive impact rather than there being a negative impact on your reputation. So we're hoping that that's the reason for the decrease this year. Next slide, please, Holly. So in terms of action taken against the fraudster after an incident of fraud, so this year we see that 52% of fraud instances were reported to the police, which is up from 37%, which is great. And I think we all share similar frustrations sometimes about the police response to fraud. So we're not quite sure how positive that experience was of reporting, but actual reporting to a criminal authority was up this year. 45% took internal disciplinary action. Again, that's up from 35% last year, which is, again, it's good to see any sort of action being taken against fraudsters, especially those that are internal to your organisation. 12% took no action at all, which is down from 21% in 2023, which is great because, again, it shows a positive reaction to an incident of fraud and that charities are being proactive. In terms of remedial action taken after an incident of fraud, I think, again, on the internal controls front, it's no surprise that 61% of charities did make some changes to their internal control changes. They're so important. Fraud can still happen even if you've got really robust controls in place, but they really are your best defence to fraud, to combating fraud. 33% made some policy changes, 14% upgraded IT systems, and 32% reviewed their fraud awareness training requirements, and 19% actually implemented an enhanced fraud awareness training programme after an incident of fraud. Now, those last two results are new results from this year, so we have nothing to compare them to, but that's a really good proactive way to deal with an incident of fraud and demonstrates charities' commitment to improving and building upon anything that they've learned throughout an instance of fraud. So that brings me to the end of our results in relation to charities' instances of fraud. So I'm going to hand over to Holly now. Holly, are you there to talk about fraud prevention?
I am, yes.
Great, thanks, Holly.
So yeah, next up we asked our respondents about fraud prevention, and specifically we were asked about their financial investment in fraud prevention. So the first question we asked was in relation to whether or not they thought that their financial investment had increased or decreased since last year. So 50% of our respondents said that their financial investment in fraud prevention had remained the same. 30% said it had increased, and that's a really encouraging statistic. Less positive, however, is the fact that 2% did say their financial investment had decreased, and a further 18% said that they made no financial investment in fraud prevention whatsoever. So the latter metric there, I guess, is the one that is of slight concern, and really all charities should be making whatever efforts they can to invest what they can in some sort of fraud prevention methods. Further of concern was the fact that that metric was 10% last year. So that does show an 8% increase in the amount of charities who are making no financial investment whatsoever. Next up, we asked them the more subjective question of whether or not they thought that their current financial investment was enough to prevent their fraud risk. So 53% of those respondents agreed that it was enough and that their investment they thought was sufficient to address their specific risks. 29% remained impartial to that question, and 15% thought that their investment was not enough. So again, those 15% that disagreed, we would just urge them to take action just as soon as possible to bring up to a level their financial investment that they thought was adequate, just given just how much of a threat fraud really can be to a charity. Still on fraud prevention, we then asked our respondents how they best protect themselves against fraud and how they would respond to fraud in the event that it happened. In particular, we asked them about the policies and plans which they have in place. So we're happy to say that the majority of charities do have the key policies in place. So for example, over 80% have one or all of either a conflict of interest policy, a whistleblowing policy, a risk register, or an anti-fraud policy in place, all of which bodes really well and makes a charity much better place to respond to fraud should it happen. We also asked about 2 new plans this year. So we asked about fraud response plans and we also asked about cyber response plans. And so 44% of respondents said they had a fraud response plan and 53% said they had a cyber response plan already in place. We also asked about fraud risk assessments and fraud awareness training. And so in respect of those ones, 36% said they'd had a fraud risk assessment in the past year, and 50% said that they had fraud awareness training in the past year. This was compared to 48% and 47% respectively last year. So both of those metrics do show a nice indication that charities are taking fraud seriously and making active efforts year on year to keep up to date with the most recent training and assessments in place. On to obstacles, we asked charities what the biggest challenges they face when it comes to preventing fraud really were. It's interesting this year that an over-reliance on trust accounted for only 37% of respondents' biggest obstacle that they reported, and this was compared to 57% last year. So that shows quite a big decrease year on year and is a really, really positive result. We think that that shows that charities are finally getting to grips with the idea that trust isn't a control and that it can't be something that we just rely upon to take care of fraud for us, that more proactive action does need to be taken. So in replacement of over-reliance on trust at the top, the biggest obstacle this year was actually a lack of internal resource, which was cited by 45% of respondents. Speaking back to the last slide, which I just mentioned, a lack of effective fraud awareness training was actually still cited by 19% of respondents this year. And then also a reluctance to actually even accept fraud as an actual risk was cited by 14% of respondents. So all of these just show just how important really that internal tone and approach to fraud risk really is in protecting your charities from fraud from the inside out. So moving on and away from fraud prevention, we then asked charities to talk to us about what they thought the future risk would be looking forward into the next 12 months. And as Tracy touched on just briefly earlier, this year, 50% of respondents did say that they expect fraud to increase next year. And so although that might seem like a large proportion still, we actually see this as a positive, as last year 64% of charities said that they expected fraud to increase. So that 14% decrease year on year does show that charities must be taking a slightly more positive and optimistic outlook to the future, which is always nice to hear. We're also keen to get you guys on the call today, your input into what you think about future fraud risk. And so the QR code on screen right now, if you would like to take your phone and scan that with the camera, that should take you to a Slido page, where you'll be able to input your own responses to the posed question. So if you would like to do that now, we will just give you a couple of moments to do that. And then Hope, would you mind pulling up the results slide just in a moment or two? So interestingly, we can see here that cyber attacks and cyber are what you're saying are your key future risks that you expect to be facing in the next 12 months. And not to ruin the thunder of the next slide, but that is relatively in keeping with what we would expect. We've also got staff in there. So like we were saying earlier, that internal threat really coming through. Got sophistication of technology, again, feeding into the kind of AI and cyber side of things. Theft of cash and stock, again, misappropriation of cash and assets. That was the top risk, the top reported fraud this year. Complacency, procurement, lack of proper controls, all things that we've touched upon and all things which really should obviously be taken into account in any sort of policies and plans which you're putting into place for the next year or so. And so with you guys now having given your input, we just wanted to go back and show you what actually the respondents of the survey said when they were posed with the exact same question. And as you can see here, cyber, again, as we said, did make up the vast majority of responses here. If you combine cyber and phishing together, they accounted for 56% of respondents in terms of what they were telling us their future risk was most likely to be. And although this obviously is a really prevalent threat at the moment, and AI and all of those developments in that space are only going to mean that's going to increase even further, we can't forget, obviously, about the threat of the more traditional types of fraud, such as misappropriation of cash and assets, which we mentioned earlier was the top fraud reported this year. So yeah, it's just so important not to only focus on cyber, which granted is a huge threat as well, but just to make sure it's a balanced and thorough response plan to all types of fraud which we're likely to face in the coming 12 months. So that's all in terms of prevention and future fraud risk. I'm going to pass on now to Sophie, who's just going to talk a little bit more about the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act.
Thanks, Holly. So continuing to look forward, the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act was introduced in October 2023 with the aim of enhancing transparency and combating economic crime. The legislation provides a framework that charities can leverage to strengthen their fraud prevention efforts. And due to the pertinence of the Act within the fraud space, we decided to ask questions within our charity fraud survey this year to ask charities to get to see how far charities understand and know about and their responsibilities, and ultimately what charities would do to ensure compliance. So what are the key highlights that we can take away from our survey? So 45% of charities understood that their organisation was captured by ECTA, meaning that they met 2 of the 3 criteria, which is having more than 250 employees, more than £36 million turnover, or more than £18 million in assets. And what was interesting is that only 2 charities were unclear whether ECTA applied to them. So this demonstrates really good knowledge among our respondents and charities. What is particularly stand out as well is that 88% of charities have taken or are committed to taking action in preparation for ECTA. And obviously our survey was conducted before the guidance was released. So that was really, really good commitment and proactivity shown by charities. So that 88% was combined by those that have taken action already, those that were planning a review, those that have undertaken a review which has been carried out under their normal procedures, and then those who are awaiting the guidance which would steer their activities going forward. And some examples of things that charities have done are conducting fraud awareness in response to ECTA, updating their policies and updating their fraud risk assessments, which are really good things. Further to this, we found that 26% of those whom ECTA did not apply to, those 26% of charities were going to take voluntary action in accordance with ECTA. So they were going to show commitment to their fraud preventions by looking at their own internal fraud prevention strategy and mechanisms to ensure that they were still in compliance with the Act, which is really, really positive and shows a really proactive viewpoint in moving that forward. And despite this being positive news among the charity sector, it's really important for charities to consider and also have a bit of caution of perhaps being affected by indirect association to ECTA. So even if a charity does not meet the criteria of ECTA, they may be deemed as an associated person of those that are. For example, banks, insurers, partners, and larger counterparts. So in order to maintain that these relationships, charities may still need to demonstrate that there's compliance with the Act. The guidance was very recently released, so on November the 6th this year, and it sets out some really key fraud prevention framework mechanisms based on the following 6 pillars. So that's top-level commitment, risk assessment, proportionate risk-based prevention procedures, due diligence, communication, which includes training, and monitoring and review. And it's a really good tool to use, even if your charity is not susceptible to the Act. We would expect charities to have these covered within all areas of your fraud prevention strategy and your fraud risk assessment anyway. I know we're really tight for time. I don't know if we're going to do the next Slido that was planned.
Hi, Sophie. I'd like to run if people have got a couple of minutes to spare.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can do it.
Great. So as before, as the previous slide, it'd be really, really good to get your input, as we've had some really good understanding and awareness, which has been shown via our survey already. Those on the call, I invite you to take part in this next poll, please. So the question is, on what date did or will the failure to prevent fraud offence come into effect? Excellent. The answer is September 2025. So the guidance came out last month, and it gives everybody who is required to under the Act and the legislation that they've got until September 2025 until that offence takes place. So a good 9 months to get those to get the fraud prevention strategies and frameworks in accordance with those 6 pillars. Thanks, Hope. I'll now pass back to Tracy.
Thank you, Sophie. I think we've bumped all the way to the front of the slides again. All I was going to say in wrap up until Hope tells me if there's any questions is that everything that we've talked about today is going to be covered in the full report, which has been launched today, and you will be sent a copy of the report for attending this webinar if you haven't received it already, or if you haven't downloaded it from our website because it's currently live. I wanted to just point out a couple of features in the report. So at the back of the report this year, on the back page, we have a helpful links and resources page. And I know you won't be able to read the resources there, but you will see when you can see the full report. But this is some resources that you can download. There's some resources there from law enforcement. There's some resources there from Fraud Advisory Panel and Charities Against Fraud Group. And if you're looking for some free resources about fraud, what it is, what it looks like, what top prevention tools could be, I think there's a really good set of resources there for you. Also scattered throughout the report are going to be some case studies. They're very brief case studies. There's usually a little bit of context about the actual case study. Some of these are cases that we've investigated. Some are ones that we've just got some information from press releases, but we've put in there as well some top tips about those types of fraud. So hopefully you'll find those useful resources. And I can see Hope has popped up, and Hope, I think I've just seen a couple of questions in the chat as well. Would you like me to deal with those?
Yes, there's a couple of questions. I guess the first one is the one that we've been able to answer, which is what does another party taking action? Who was that other party? I think from the report we can gauge it was the suppliers, third parties, the banks, etc. There's a question in there about more about how frauds can occur, common features, but I also think we've covered that one off as well, looking at the most common fraud types, and that cyber is important to take into consideration, but we do see more traditional fraud types actually taking place in charities. That is actually all the questions. So I guess I'll wrap up and say thank you. So thank you so much to the guys at BDO for being involved, for helping us write such a fantastic report and sitting down with us to go through it so well and kind of explaining everything that we would want to know about it. It's the end of Charity Fraud Awareness Week officially now, but if you've missed anything from this week, everything's on the Preventing Charity Fraud website. There are blog posts. We had Phil Tapey from Cancer Research writing an ECTA help sheet, just if you're confused at all by ECTA and the failure to prevent fraud offence. We sat down with some international regulators to discuss fraud and how they come up with their regulations working with charities, and the report will also be available there. So from me at Fraud Advisory Panel, and hopefully from all the guys at BDO, thanks so much. And if you do have any questions that you couldn't ask here, please feel free to get in touch with us and ask, and we'll see if we can answer them. So thank you very much.